Now, normally I don't do broadcasts about a single item or a single piece of news, but I think in this case I might make a bit of an exception because what happened yesterday in Canada, I think, has a direct bearing on what should happen in Scotland in the next year or two. I'm referring to the replacement of Justin Trudeau, the former Prime Minister of Canada, with the new leader of his party, who is actually Mark Carney. Now, if the name Mark Carney sounds familiar, it's because he used to be, until quite recently, the governor of the Bank of England. Now, Carney is an economist, a banker, and a man who knows what he's talking about when it comes to money. And that, I think, gives him a unique perspective on the political situation, particularly not just in Canada, but everywhere, really, that there are large countries trying to extract resources from smaller ones. Now, Carney was replying to comments made by Donald Trump about how nice it would be if Canada became the 51st state of the United States of America. Now, Carney has pretty much laughed that out of court. His comments are very, very plain, and he's told Trump in no uncertain terms that Canadians will never, ever give up their sovereignty to the United States. And certainly there's no reason for them to do so. There would be no advantage to that. Trump believes that he can threaten Canada by saying, well, we'll not protect you if there is a Russian act of aggression, say in the Arctic Circle or anywhere where Canada has a boundary with the Russian state. Now, it doesn't actually have a physical boundary. As far as I remember from the geography of the area, they share an area of the Arctic Circle to some extent across a body of water. So Canada is sort of facing towards Russia. But what Carney has said quite clearly is that he would never allow Canada's resources to be plundered by the likes of Donald Trump in the way that Trump is attempting to do with President Zelensky by getting him to sign over a massive mineral deal in Ukraine in exchange for American help with dealing with a ceasefire. Now, interestingly, as a part of what's been going on with Ukraine recently, Marco Rubio, who is, as far as I remember, he's the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, I think, at the moment in the Trump administration. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But Rubio has said, even today, during the talks in Saudi Arabia, yeah, okay, so he's in Saudi Arabia. What he said is that any signature that Zelensky makes to any deal with Trump over the extraction of minerals from Ukraine by American companies is not actually linked. It's not a condition of America helping to negotiate a ceasefire. Now, that's an interesting take, because up until now, everybody has thought that Trump meant that unless Ukraine ceded control over these so-called rare earth minerals, that there wouldn't be any deal. Rubio has shot that down, and I think the American administration has now started to reshuffle and redraw and to effectively rewrite what Trump has already stated. And it's become an awful lot less confrontational and non-conditional. However, what Carney is saying is that Canada would never allow America to do to them what Trump was hoping to do to Ukraine under any circumstances. And that is great. They would not allow the extraction of minerals. They would not allow American corporations or Americans generally to benefit from anything which belonged on the territory of Canada. And nor would he cede sovereignty, in other words, the sovereignty of the Canadian Parliament, to any other body. Now, this is interesting because Carney, unlike a lot of other people during the 2014 referendum here in Scotland on independence, was one of the few people who talked sense to the British media when they claimed that Scotland would not be able to use British pounds. And remember the United Kingdom and its three amigos who plotted, the three-party leaders, to tell the Scots that they couldn't use pounds if they became independent? Well, that was a lie. And Carney was the man who nailed that lie, because most people didn't understand the difference between currency and cash. Currency is just the denomination which is used for international trade, whereas cash is the stuff that you deal with every day. And Carney was pointing out that the currency, after Scotland became independent, wouldn't matter. In fact, Scotland could continue to use the pound as currency. It could continue even to use pounds as cash, and it would make no difference whatsoever to the way Scotland dealt internally with its finances. And he was the only person who actually, in a position of power in the United Kingdom at the time, actually gave any credence to this at all. And I think it's interesting that because he supported the Scottish cause in correcting this obvious lie, that he has now gone on to greater things in Canada. And he is actually proposing to reject all overtures from America and make sure that Canada keeps its sovereignty and its independence from the US. And this is a strangely ironic situation, given the fact that Scotland never gave its sovereignty up to England, even when it signed the Treaty of Union in 1707. Because before that was even signed, the Scots had already elicited a condition from the English negotiators at the time, and that was that the Scots would retain their sovereignty in all time coming, no matter what the Union became or what it did or how it saw itself in the future. And because of this, we still have that sovereignty today. And because we still have that sovereignty today, there is no reason at all why we as Scots should do anything at all that we don't want to do. In other words, we don't have to take our orders from Westminster. Our own people, that's all of us, all 5.5 million of us, still have the sovereignty that we had back in 1707. That's not changed. And yet the English government and the English establishment has assumed sovereignty over Scotland, despite the fact that their own king has never sworn the accession oath to the Scottish crown and is not entitled to either call himself the King of Scots or to wear the royal regalia of Scotland, that is the crown and the sceptre and the cloak and all the rest of it. So Charles is not the King of Scots. He can't be, he's not allowed to be, because he's never taken the oath, and our sovereignty is still intact. So why don't we use it? I think the answer to that is that the politicians that we currently have in our alleged Scottish Parliament, and I say the word alleged here because it's not really a Scottish Parliament. It's a gigantic regional council which forms part of the greater English state, calling itself Great Britain or the UK. And because of that, the politicians who are employed there, and all of them, I'm not talking just about one or two, I'm talking about every politician in Holyrood is employed by the United Kingdom and paid by their treasury. And so they can't really do anything at the moment. And not that they can't, but they won't do anything. They don't want to give up their salaries, their careers, their positions of power, the positions they hold in government as ministers. They don't want to give any of that up. Who would? And that's a perfectly natural thing for anybody to think. The trouble is that it's not actually necessary. Even right now, all of those politicians in Holyrood could simply walk out of the chamber and refuse to participate in a British Parliament sitting in Edinburgh and set up their own. But they won't. And they won't because of the reasons I just mentioned. So that leaves the people of Scotland, who still have their sovereignty, with a tricky task. And that tricky task is to exercise that sovereignty as a people, rather than relying on politicians to do it, who can't or won't. And that means that we now have to wait until Salvo, which has been preparing the case for the United Nations, which will correct a mistake, correct a lie which was told way back when the United Nations was forming, and when it looked at every country that was currently in the UN and asked them all the same question: which countries do you have as colonies? England refused to say that Scotland was a colony, and instead described it as in a voluntary union. Now, if it were a voluntary union, we could volunteer to leave it, except that we're not allowed to. And because we're not allowed to, we don't have full access to democracy, which is a precondition for decolonization within the UN. And that is exactly what Salvo is aiming to prove that Scots, as the sovereign people of this land, still have the right to vote to end the Union, regardless of what the politicians say. And that means that by the time the next general election for the English Parliament at Holyrood takes place, we need to have had that response from the UN and that reclassification of Scotland not as a part of a greater United Kingdom which we volunteered to join, because we never did. Nobody volunteered for it, none of us got a vote on it, and in 1707 the deal was done by probably less than 24 prominent negotiators who were either bribed, coerced or threatened by the English state in order to get this deal through. But the one good thing they did was maintain Scottish sovereignty after the Union, and so we still have it. All we need now is the go-ahead from the UN, which says that yes, the Scots still have that sovereignty and can use it. And that means that they must have a referendum on independence when they want it, and it should be free and fair. And it doesn't necessarily have to be organised by politicians. It simply needs to be organised by a respected institution, which is perhaps non-political. Not sure what that might be, but certainly something could do that. And the something which Salvo had in mind is an organisation called Liberation Scotland. Liberation Scotland is the group of individuals, sovereign Scots, who have signed up to Liberation Scotland, signed up basically to a pledge that they agree that this is what they want to do. And the more of us agree to that, then the bigger that group becomes. And when that group becomes a certain size, then it's recognised by the UN as a political force, as an institution which is capable of taking decisions like this. And that would remove the decision-making powers, if you like, in inverted commas, or the lack of them, from our politicians' grasp. And I think, to be honest with you, there are going to be difficult times ahead, because no matter how this shakes out, and assuming that we do get the UN backing that we need to demonstrate that we have this sovereignty still, and we should be allowed to use it by the UK is going to drag its feet. It may agree that we have the sovereignty when it's forced to by the UN, but it's certainly not going to make things happen quickly. And we may need to be patient a little bit longer before we see any signs of the promised second referendum. But what Mark Carney has done in his speech, to come back to the original part of this broadcast, is he's demonstrated what Scotland should do. Exactly what it should do. It should resist this union. We never volunteered for it. We were coerced and threatened into it, almost starved into it, by a full naval blockade of all of our ports and all of our territories, so that we had to sign it. And that is certainly not voluntary. And that being the case, there is no way that this phony union can continue any longer. But we certainly need external help. And the external help we really have to get is the support of one or more United Nations member states who say that they will support Scotland in its bid to have a referendum to give every sovereign Scottish voter the right to choose whether to remain in the Union or not. And that will include, of course, all of those who do want to stay in the Union. That's what democracy is about. But I believe that the people who want to leave the United Kingdom and have Scotland become or return to its original status as a fully sovereign state with every power that that entails, I believe that that number now vastly exceeds the number of people who want to stay in the Union. Polls have indicated a variety of things. The United Kingdom polls tend to always be stuck in the low 50s, just above a margin of error that the Scots want independence. But if you talk to people around the streets, any random person, and ask them what they think, most of them will tell you that they think that we really should be given another choice, another chance to say whether we want to stay in the Union or not. They may not be completely converted to the idea of independence, but they'll be no longer opposed to it, because they can see how the United Kingdom is sliding gradually into an unpleasant decline where nothing gets done, potholes remain unfilled, the governments of the day cutting spending on vital public services which support all of the vulnerable people we have in favour of ramping up, for example, arms production to sell to countries like Ukraine. This is an opportunity for the UK to make money out of someone else's misery. That's not something which most Scots are behind. Whether you support Ukraine or not, I think the idea of making money out of the Ukrainian suffering is not a worthy cause. But anyway, that aside, I think the most important thing to remember right now is that within the next 12 to 18 months, something will happen with the UN that will allow all of us sovereign Scots to get together and to vote once again on leaving the Union. And hopefully this time we might actually get a fair vote, because we know the 2014 referendum was run by the UK. They used all of their media power to convince us that we had to stay, either because they loved us or because they were going to threaten us if we left. We didn't have anything to respond with back then, and we have very little to respond with now in terms of media. But we have shows like mine, shows like people like Grace Peter, and many other people who make programs online. Through Scottish Prism is another well-known pro-independence program. So I'm going to stay here for as long as is necessary to get us to the point where we have that vital second referendum and finally take the plunge and say we've had enough of this managed decline and this lack of investment and the robbing of our resources, something which Canada would never put up with. And Mark Carney, the man who was the chief of the Bank of England, knew that Canada should never allow. Scotland should never allow it either. And that really is the point of today's broadcast. I'll see you all soon. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.